I'm Joanna, an ambulance driver for over 10 years. I've seen a lot in this profession, but nothing prepared me for what happened that stormy night. The clock struck midnight when we received an urgent call. A woman had been found disoriented in an isolated house on the outskirts of town. The sound of rain hitting the windshield and the echo of thunder created a grim scene as I drove down the dark road. My partner Carlos was beside me, trying to communicate with the dispatch, but the radio seemed to have stopped working. After a few minutes, we finally arrived at the house. It was an old, almost dilapidated building surrounded by trees swaying in the wind. When we entered, we found the woman sitting on the floor, trembling. Her eyes were glazed over, and she was muttering incoherently. "He's coming. He's coming." We tried to calm her, but her anxiety was palpable. We decided to take her to the hospital immediately. Carlos helped her up and secured her on the stretcher. I watched as he fastened the safety belts. During the trip, the woman started to thrash and scream. Her eyes rolled back, and she kept whispering about an evil presence. "He's here. He's here." Panic began to take hold of me, but I kept my focus on the road. Suddenly, all the equipment in the ambulance started to malfunction. The heart monitor flashed erratically, and the interior lights flickered. An intense cold sensation filled the vehicle. I looked at Carlos, and he was visibly scared. "What's happening?" he asked, but I had no answer. Then I saw something in the rearview mirror. A dark shadow, almost human but with distorted contours, was in the back of the ambulance. My heart raced. I looked again, and the shadow seemed to be moving towards us. Panic made me step on the accelerator, but the road seemed endless. The woman began to scream louder. "He came for me! He came for me!" Her words echoed in my mind, amplifying the terror I already felt. Carlos tried to restrain her, but an invisible force seemed to be pulling her towards the shadow. I felt as if we were being pulled into another dimension, a place of darkness and despair. Suddenly, the ambulance stopped abruptly, as if it had collided with an invisible wall. I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't respond. The silence was overwhelming. I looked back, and the woman was still, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Carlos tried to calm her, but it was useless. He was also terrified. And then it happened. The shadow quickly approached, enveloping the woman. Her screams stopped abruptly, and everything went silent. The temperature inside the ambulance dropped even more, and a cold vapor escaped from her mouth. When the shadow disappeared, the woman was gone too. Only her blanket remained, folded neatly. Carlos and I were in shock, unable to understand what had happened. When we finally managed to get the ambulance running again, we returned to the hospital in silence, trying to process the horror we had witnessed. Later, we learned that the house where we found the woman had a dark history. Years before, a man had died there under mysterious circumstances, and rumors said his spirit roamed the place, seeking revenge. I never returned to that road at night, and the memory of that call still haunts me. I will never forget the terror of that night, and I always wonder if the shadow will return to claim someone else. The following days were tough. Carlos and I tried to forget what happened, but the memories haunted us. The hospital opened an investigation, but nothing was found. There were no records of the woman we rescued, and no one reported her missing. It was as if she never existed. A week later, during another night shift, I received another urgent call. This time, it was a child who had gotten lost in the forest near the town. The destination, the same road leading to the house where it all happened. My heart raced, but I knew I couldn't refuse the call. Carlos was with me again, and we exchanged apprehensive looks. as we drove to the location. The road was even darker this time. The full moon illuminated the tree branches, creating sinister moving shadows. When we arrived at the forest entrance, we found a desperate search party. The child's parents were crying, begging us to find their child. We entered the forest with flashlights in hand, the dense vegetation making it hard to pass. The parents' cries echoed in the distance, mixing with the sound of our steps on the damp ground. Suddenly, we heard a faint cry. We ran towards the sound, our hearts pounding. There was the child, sitting beside an old tree with deep claw marks on its trunk. I picked up the girl in my arms, and she whispered something that chilled me to the bone. "He found me." The words were the same the woman had said that fateful night. We ran back to the ambulance, the girl clutched tightly in my arms. When we entered the ambulance, the lights started flickering again. I looked at Carlos, and he was pale. "Not again," he muttered, trying to stay calm. On the way back to the hospital, the temperature dropped again, and the same shadow appeared in the back of the ambulance. This time, it was more defined, almost tangible. The girl started screaming, pointing at the shadow. "He's here! He's here!" I tried to speed up, but the road seemed to stretch infinitely. Carlos tried to calm the girl, but the shadow started moving towards us, slow and relentless. We felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on us, and the fear was almost paralyzing. Suddenly the shadow stopped and looked directly at me. Its eyes, two bright red points, penetrated my soul. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if my heart was being squeezed by invisible hands. The ambulance began to lose control, and I struggled to keep it on the road. In a last act of desperation, the girl screamed, "Go away, leave us alone." The shadow hesitated for a moment, then vanished as if sucked into the darkness. We managed to reach the hospital, where we handed the girl over to the doctors. She was in shock, but alive. Carlos and I were exhausted, physically and emotionally. We reported the incident, but once again, there was no rational explanation. After that night, Carlos requested a transfer to another city, unable to continue. I stayed, but with the certainty that something evil inhabited that road. To this day, I avoid passing through there, fearing the shadow might return to claim another soul. The story of the missing woman and the found child became a legend among the local paramedics, a horror tale passed down from generation to generation. And I, every time I look in the ambulance's rearview mirror, can't help but hope not to see those red eyes again. My name is Marcos, and I've been an ambulance driver for almost 15 years. I've seen a lot on the job, but nothing compares to the night of the ghostly passenger. It started as a typical night shift, with routine calls and usual emergencies. Little did I know that my life was about to change forever. It was around 3 a.m. when we received a call about a car accident on a remote, fog-covered highway. My partner Anna and I quickly responded, making our way through the dense fog that seemed to swallow our vehicle whole. The air was heavy and visibility was almost zero. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant sound of our siren, echoing through the night. As we approached the scene, we saw a lone figure standing by the wrecked car, a woman in a white dress, her long hair drenched from the fog. She was waving frantically, and my heart raced. We parked the ambulance and hurried over. The woman seemed unhurt, but visibly shaken. She kept pointing to the back seat of the car, saying, "He's hurt, he's hurt." Anna and I carefully opened the back door and found a man lying unconscious, his face pale and covered in blood. We quickly moved him onto a stretcher and loaded him into the ambulance. As we secured him, the woman climbed into the back with us, insisting on staying by his side. I found it odd, but there was no time to argue. With the patient stabilized, I started the engine and we headed towards the nearest hospital. The fog was thicker than ever, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, watching Anna tend to the man while the woman sat silently, her eyes fixed on him. About 10 minutes into the drive, the atmosphere inside the ambulance changed. The temperature dropped drastically, and my breath started to fog up. I glanced at Anna, who looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Suddenly, the monitors attached to our patient began to flicker. The heart rate monitor beeped erratically, and the oxygen levels dropped dangerously low. Anna worked frantically to stabilize him, but the equipment seemed to have a life of its own. The woman in the white dress started to hum a haunting melody, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I felt a chill run down my spine. The fog outside seemed to press in on us, and I could barely see the road. Then, I saw something in the mirror that made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure standing at the back of the ambulance, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was staring directly at the woman. I turned to Anna. "Do you see that?" She nodded, fear etched on her face. The woman's humming grew louder, and she turned to look at me with hollow, empty eyes. "He's here for him," she said, her voice echoing in the confined space. "He won't let him go." The shadow moved closer, and the temperature dropped even further. The lights inside the ambulance flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I pressed the gas pedal harder, trying to outrun whatever was following us, but the road seemed endless. The woman began to scream, her voice mixing with the sound of the monitors and the beeping of the equipment. Anna tried to calm her down, but it was no use. The man on the stretcher started to convulse, his body writhing in pain. The shadow reached out, and I felt a force pulling the ambulance off the road. We skidded to a stop, and I jumped out, opening the back doors. The woman was gone. The man lay still, his eyes open and lifeless. Anna looked at me, her face white as a sheet. "What the hell just happened?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. We reported the incident, but no one believed us. There was no record of the woman or the man. The car at the accident scene had vanished, leaving no trace. To this day, Anna and I don't talk about that night. The ghostly passenger haunts my dreams, and every time I drive through the fog, I can feel those hollow eyes watching me, waiting for their next victim. My name is Ricardo, and I've been an ambulance driver for over 15 years. The story I'm about to tell is one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. Even after so many years, that night still haunts me. Let me tell you what happened on that fateful night when we encountered something that shouldn't exist. It was a rainy and dark night when my partner Gustavo and I began our shift. Things were calm until we received an urgent call from a local psychiatric hospital. A patient had escaped and was causing disturbances in the surrounding area. The call asked us to go there and assist in containing the patient. When we arrived, the scene was even more eerie than we had imagined. The hospital was located in a remote area, surrounded by dense vegetation and enveloped in thick fog. The building appeared desolate, with broken windows and rusted doors. The air was heavy, and a sense of oppression hung over us. The hospital staff informed us that the patient, a man in his 30s, was violent and disoriented. "He believes he's being chased by something," said one of the nurses, her voice trembling. They directed us to where the patient had last been seen and warned us to be cautious. We proceeded carefully and soon found the man hiding in a dark corridor near an old abandoned ward. He had wide, fearful eyes, and his body was trembling uncontrollably. With great effort, we managed to convince him to enter the ambulance. What unsettled us the most was the terrified expression he had as he kept looking back, as if seeing something we could not. We placed the man on the stretcher and transported him to the ambulance. As we drove down the road, things began to get strange. The patient was in constant panic, muttering incoherently and begging us not to leave him. "He's behind me. He's everywhere," he repeated endlessly. The road was deserted and winding, and the rain was pouring down heavily. The headlights barely cut through the darkness. Suddenly, we started hearing strange noises coming from the back of the ambulance, as if something was scratching and banging against the walls. Gustavo and I exchanged worried glances, and he tried to check what was happening. To our horror, there was nothing visible. Then we began to notice an increasing chill. The temperature inside the ambulance dropped dramatically, and our breaths condensed. I glanced at Gustavo, who looked at me with wide eyes, his face pale. "Do you feel that?" he whispered. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Suddenly, the monitors attached to our patient started to flicker. The heart rate monitor beeped erratically, and the oxygen levels fell dangerously low. Gustavo worked frantically to stabilize him, but the equipment seemed to have a mind of its own. The man in the stretcher became increasingly agitated, his eyes darting around the ambulance as if he was seeing something terrifying. When I looked in the rear-view mirror, something made my blood run cold. A shadowy figure seemed to float at the back of the ambulance, its eyes glowing with a sinister red light. The shadow moved fluidly, slowly approaching the agitated man. The fear was so intense that I could barely breathe. Gustavo shouted to speed up, but the ambulance lights began to flicker and the systems failed. The man on the stretcher started to scream louder, his voice echoing in absolute despair. "He's here! He's coming!" The shadow advanced, and an invisible pressure seemed to hold us down. I felt an overwhelming force pressing on my chest and a penetrating coldness. The vehicle started to shake, and I almost lost control. Panic took over, and Gustavo was in a state of shock. With superhuman effort, I managed to stop the ambulance in the middle of the road. I ran outside, trying to regain my composure. When I opened the back doors, the figure had disappeared. The man lay still, his eyes open and vacant. Gustavo and I removed him from the ambulance and took him back to the hospital, where he was immediately sedated and placed under observation. We reported the incident, but the authorities found no explanation for what had happened. The patient was never seen again, and the psychiatric hospital was soon closed, citing security problems and unexplained events. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. Whenever I pass by dark or abandoned places, I feel the presence of that entity watching me, waiting in the corridor of my mind. The cold and fear of that night have never left me, and every time I close my eyes, I find myself back in that ambulance, trying to escape from the horror that should never have existed. My name is Anna, and I have been a nurse for over a decade. What I'm about to share is one of the most terrifying experiences of my career, and it happened on a night when the ordinary mixed with the supernatural, all within an ambulance. It was a cold and rainy night when we began our shift. The team was in high spirits, and the night seemed like it would be quiet. We were prepared for any situation, but I never imagined what was about to unfold. At 2 a.m., we received an urgent call about a car accident. The request was clear. The situation was critical, and the patient needed to be transported urgently. We arrived at the accident scene quickly. It was devastating. The car was completely wrecked, and a man was gravely injured, trapped between the wreckage. With great care, we managed to extricate the man and prepare him for transport. As we placed him in the ambulance, I noticed something odd. The temperature inside the ambulance dropped abruptly, and an intense cold began to spread throughout the cabin. The man was unconscious and in critical condition. The medical team did their best to stabilize him while I drove. The road was slippery due to the rain, and visibility was poor. The sense of urgency was palpable, and I tried to stay calm while navigating the winding road. However, strange things began to happen. Each time I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw shadows moving. The ambulance lights flickered intermittently, and the communication system failed several times. The discomfort grew, and a chilling cold seemed to invade the vehicle, making the atmosphere oppressive. Suddenly, the control panel started to malfunction. The patient's vital signs monitors flickered and emitted erratic alarms. The numbers moved irregularly, and the patient's breathing became uneven. The team and I struggled to understand what was happening, but the environment inside the ambulance became increasingly disturbing. During a brief blackout, when the ambulance lights went out completely, the sense of dread intensified. I felt a strange presence, as if something was watching and approaching us. The space was plunged into total darkness, and the noises coming from the back of the ambulance were unsettling. The cold was so intense that my teeth chattered, and the pressure in my chest became nearly unbearable. When the lights came back on, I saw something I could barely believe. At the back of the ambulance, a shadowy, nebulous figure seemed to float. Its outlines were indistinct, and its eyes glowed with a sinister red light. The figure seemed to be moving closer to the patient, and the atmosphere was charged with an almost palpable tension. The patient began to convulse and scream, his voice filled with terror and despair. He mumbled something about something pulling him into the darkness and a presence that wouldn't let him go. His words were incoherent, but the sense of horror was clear. The team was in shock, struggling to stabilize the patient while trying to make sense of what was happening. The next blackout was even more terrifying. The dark figure seemed to be almost upon us, and the environment grew so cold that the breath condensed in the air. We felt an invisible pressure that seemed to suffocate us, and the noise from the monitors was almost deafening. It was as if the ambulance itself was being consumed by an unknown and malevolent force. With desperate effort, we managed to speed up and escape that eerie road. When we finally arrived at the hospital, the team was visibly shaken. We took the patient to the trauma center, where he was immediately placed in intensive care. The monitors were checked, but the technicians found no explanation for the problems that occurred during the transport. The ambulance was inspected, but no mechanical failures were found. The patient survived, but his mental state seemed to have been deeply affected by the experience. We reported the incident, but no one seemed to believe that something supernatural had occurred. That shift was marked by a sense of terror that never left me. Whenever there's a blackout or a power failure, I remember the dark figure in the ambulance and the oppressive presence that seemed to haunt us. The cold, the fear, and the feeling that something malevolent was watching us continue to haunt me to this day. We never really knew what happened that night, but the experience left a deep and lasting mark on all of us.